Currently, it seems that the world has plunged into a series of local wars, and this conflict is gaining momentum, and it's going on in different parts of the globe. So, what do you believe are the reasons for the latest exacerbation of modern day armed conflicts? What are the main reasons behind that?
I mean, to be honest, I'm not a grand theoretician of what happens in the world. I study one thing and I write fun non-fiction books about propaganda and people, and I often avoid these sort of big subjects. But what is very obvious is that Russia is in the middle of it constantly, and it's kind of a pattern, a repeating pattern, whether it's obviously bringing genocide to the heart of Europe, but also clearly deeply embedded in a network of deeply nefarious dictatorial regimes, which include North Korea, Iran, helping their proxies like Hezbollah for many years. So, you know, if there's a recurring pattern in the kind of destruction of the so-called rules-based order, that pattern is Russia.
So do you believe this so-called axis of evil, has it already been formed as such, or is it still on the way?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's an old phrase.
Yeah.
Maybe we need, you know, I do think about language a lot, and I do think we sometimes need to find new language. That's very important. I mean, what is it exactly? Axis is a little bit strong, isn't it? It's a group of interests which they're more like a network, you know? They're more like a network united by corruption, by financial gains, but also by a deep resentment towards democracy and democratic allies. Their own interests don't always coincide. I don't think Iran and Russia are happy allies, let alone China. But they're a network. I think they're a network. And they're also united to terrorist networks, criminal networks. So they're more like a criminal network, really.
Well, given your field, of course, we should talk about, and we must talk about propaganda and the fight against it. And we see how Russia skillfully adapts its propaganda guidebooks and its tools to react to what's going on exactly at this period of time, and to try to tailor its messages to concrete audiences to make sure they get through. And we now see the conflict in Israel and Gaza developing, and how Russia also uses this one to undermine Western assistance to Ukraine by switching the focus, by further downplaying the importance of what's going on in Ukraine and the fight we're in. So do you think we're doing enough, or do you think we're doing right things at the moment in terms of fighting this propaganda as it develops, as it brings in new narratives, new messages to the Western world?
So, look, when Russia advocates openly and obviously for what you just said, you know, forget about Ukraine, think about the Middle East, nobody listens to them. That is not a winning narrative, because it's Russia and everyone can see it. That's not the clever bit of their propaganda. What they're doing is much more nefarious, and when it's effective, it's when it's indirect. Direct propaganda can work if your cause is just and people support you, but everybody kind of knows now in Western countries that Russia is not a partner or anybody you can ever believe. What they're doing in Europe is much more. What they're doing in Europe is much more cunning and much more risky to our interests. They are simultaneously stoking anti-Western, anti-Israel, and anti-Semitic feeling among huge Muslim populations in Europe. We see very large protests against the actions of Israel and the West in places like Germany, while at the same time stoking anti-immigrant, in this case Muslim immigrant, but general anti-immigrant feeling among the right wing, again in somewhere like Germany. So what they're doing is they're not even there. They're not even in that fight, but they're strengthening those contradictions, probably thinking about creating a maximally anti-refugee sentiment, especially in Germany, where they're very invested, and probably calculating that when their bombardment of Ukraine starts, there'll be another wave of refugees from Ukraine, which will be coming into a country that is already super anti-refugee. That's the game that they're playing. Clever and effective propaganda, you're not there. So when Russia is saying stuff, maybe that works for some audiences, but not for any audiences that matter very much. No, they're playing a much more potentially effective game.
What about the United States? We see that the MAGA wing is getting stronger by day, and the messages that we want to get to them, they're not getting through. That's including that the American money does not actually go to Ukraine. The American money stays in the United States, and it creates new jobs. It creates new opportunities for the American businesses. That's just one example. We see religious propaganda gaining momentum. We see how religious conservatives, they are jumping this bandwagon of Ukraine allegedly banning all Christianity in our country. I mean, messages that we find ridiculous, but for average Americans, many people from rural America, they find feedback. So do you think we are able, I mean, civic sector, diplomacy, politicians, journalists, are we able to try to win the hearts of Republicans in this case, or should we focus on something else and something more wide? So
I'm doing a lot of research about public opinion towards Ukraine in America. And the first thing I would say is support for Ukraine is still very, very, very strong. So I think in America, we have a bigger crisis, which is American politics no longer represents American people. There is a huge divide between the grotesque polarization in American politics and the reality of America. If there was a centrist party in America, it would be in power all the time. The vast majority of Americans have the right instincts and the right ideas about Ukraine, the right instincts and the right priorities about Putin. We're just in a very weird place where 5 extremist politicians can hold the whole of the Republican Party hostage. Yeah? In a different situation where the Republicans had won Congress easily, this wouldn't have been a problem. We have a tiny amount of extremist politicians playing to a very specific cohort of society, which is around 15%, who they need to stay in power in their states. So we have a very messed up system. So please don't get it confused with the American public opinion, which is vastly in favor of Ukraine and vastly against Russia. If we're talking about the MAGA vote, it's around maybe half of Republicans. And again, they're not pro-Russia. The thing is, they really hate Biden. And they hate Biden more than they hate Putin. And they are anti-Ukraine because they're anti-Biden, not because they're anti-Ukraine. Once you're anti-Biden, you will look for any evidence to be anti-Biden. Corruption, Nazis in Ukraine, it doesn't matter. But it's that motivation which starts. So if you want to appeal to this segment of society, which again is around, I mean, it's half of Republican voters, so it's maybe 15, 20% of Americans. You have to understand what they really care about. They don't care, I know this sounds really hard, they don't care about Russia or Ukraine, they care about America, and they care about their version of America. And here's the interesting thing about these people that the research shows. They're the people who, more than anybody else in America, think America needs to be the strongest country in the world and show its strength. So if you want to engage these people, you have to talk to them about American strength. You have to talk to them about how Russia is a force in the world that wants to undermine American strength, which it is. You have to talk to them how Russia works with countries like Iran to hurt America and to humiliate America. And you have to explain that to them and show them how Russia does it. Because while it's support Ukraine, it's something very, very far away. When it's something that threatens the primacy of American strength, then it's something they can get very engaged with. It's worth recalling that it was Trump who bombed Assad, not Obama, not Biden. It's Trump who did that. So even to these audiences, there's a way to reach them, but you have to understand what motivates them. And I wouldn't get too distracted by this disinformation stuff. You know, people will choose whatever disinformation they want when they want to. And if you give people a stronger reason to be on your side, they'll leave it aside. Sadly, these are audiences where truth doesn't matter very much. You've really got to get to their values and their emotional core. And there is a way of reaching them. You just have to understand what they care about. And everybody in America hates Putin. You just got to make it clear that it's their cause as well.
It's best to say that Putin is preventing you from making America great again.
Yeah, yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah, and not, yeah, that's exactly, you've already got a good start.
Check.
On the churches thing, I would be spending a lot of time in American churches.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a very strong moral case to make, a very strong moral case to make about why it's necessary to fight Russia. So again, these are all audiences that can be reached. The only audiences which I think are completely lost are actually on the kind of weird left, the truly isolationist audiences who truly don't want America involved. They're not actually the right-wing audiences. It's paradoxical. Once you get into the data, you start seeing a lot of these cliches fall away. What MAGA audiences don't care about is stuff like the rules-based international order or NATO. They don't care about any of that. They're ready for America to leave NATO. They really are. So those arguments won't work. Talking about, you know, the international architecture of like the world order, they're like, we hate the world order. So don't do that argument.
I understand. Well, getting back to propaganda and fighting it, I know a lot of work is being done to try to collect together evidence to eventually bring to justice those who spread that propaganda, who foment hatred, enmity, who actually contribute to genocidal efforts that the Russian army is committing in Ukraine. Could you please tell what would be the right way to maybe not only collect that evidence, but to spread awareness, including among Russian propagandists, those pundits and hosts and politicians, that they will eventually be held accountable, hopefully?
Yeah, it's more complicated than it sounds because Russian propagandists use, obviously, genocidal speech. They call to wipe out Ukrainian statehood, wipe out Ukrainian identity. They call for indiscriminate bombardment of civilian populations. And that is important already. That could already be a crime in itself. You know, different types of speech can be crimes. But for it to be a really strong case, you've got to tie it to effects, to things that actually happened. So if you're going for genocidal speech, you kind of want to do it with genocide. You know, and genocide is very hard to prove. I think there's a very strong case against Russia, but it's hard. It's not the quick route. So I think we're going to focus on specific war crimes and the relationship between propaganda and war crimes. What's changed with the digital era is that you can do a lot more research showing how propaganda is combined with military actions. Yeah? If before it was just a guy on the radio and then something happened, now you can start following the digital traces. You know, was there an increase in digital activity that helped aid and abet a specific war crime in the lead up to that crime? It's much easier to do that now. So we live in a new media age, and no one's really tried to hold propagandists legally accountable in this age. It's happened before. At Nuremberg, some Nazi propagandists were held accountable. Yugoslavia. Frankly, propagandists usually get away with it. There's a few cases where they're found guilty in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Nazi Germany. But overall, the propagandists usually walk away. They say it was just words. Words don't kill anyone. And they say, we didn't know. We're just little propagandists, you know. We're just guys. We get given a piece of paper. We don't know what's going to happen. So they usually get away with it. The job is to prove that they're actually integrated into the machine of war crimes.
So their actions must be proven to be deliberate, and there has to be a cause and effect.
So cause and effect can be many different things. So it's not like you say something, someone picks up a gun, someone shoots something. It can be much, much more loose than that. It can be around aiding and abetting. It can be around incitement. It can be it can be about legitimization. It's not like, I heard Simonian, I picked up a gun and I killed someone. That's not cool. It can be, cause and effect is much more diffuse than that. Nobody's looking for that sort of linear cause and effect. So, but you do want to tie it to things on the ground. What I mean is simply saying, oh, they said terrible things. That is a crime. Hate speech can be a crime. Propaganda for war in some jurisdictions is a crime. Just the speech itself can be a crime. That could already be something to get them on. But the more you tie it to real crimes on the ground and real harms, the stronger the bigger the charge will be, you know.
You've been talking about the digital era and the ways that propaganda is spreading, and the tools that you now have as an expert and your colleagues have to trace how this propaganda spreads, how those links work. But on the other end, we have those propagandists who use the same technology, or even better technology in some cases, that they create in Russia, those IT guys, to work with big data and to tailor their messages to address certain audiences. What do you think will be the next level? Like, do you have any vision of how it will develop, like in the short term? What are we about to see in terms of influences? Have you been working on that?
Well, listen, technology is always developing, and propaganda develops with technology. It always has done. So whatever, ChatGPT will come next, or you know, or deep fakes. So technology is always developing, and in that sense, propaganda is always reinventing itself. But the more I look at it, and I've been looking at it historically a lot as well for a new book, the more it also stays the same. You know, it is about a race to who can understand people better, understand their motivations better, and who's going to win that race. Is it going to be the propagandists or those who want to communicate democratic values? And it's about tapping into people's anger and hatred and making that hatred normal, and creating an environment where you can commit different types of crimes. So none of that changes. You know, that stays the same from century to century and from technology to technology. But of course it also transforms with, you know, the latest ChatGPT fixation or deep fake. It's always changing. But actually it also comes down to something very old and human and about good and evil.
Well, we see that the West is desperately trying to seize back the initiative in, you know, in public space worldwide, as we see the anti-Semitic statements spreading like dramatically around the world, as you noticed in Europe and also in the United States. We see the protests, we see famous people speaking up on subjects that they don't know anything about, just on emotions, you know. Do you think that, do you suggest that the West was just simply not ready for this level of escalation?
Yeah, I mean there's a paradox, because so many of the technologies are developed in the West. So many of the social research, you know, sociology, you know, are developed in the West. But they're developed around things like elections or advertising. And what we have stopped doing in the West is thinking about whatever you want to call it, political warfare, information war, you know, this reality that Russia, China, Iran, terrorists have embraced. They've embraced the new technologies and made it a tool of their foreign policy and a tool of their information warfare, if you want to call it that. We kind of haven't. It's more an institutional thing. You know, we just don't. Whose job is it? You know, there's no one whose job it is to do it. This is not public diplomacy or PR or anything like that. This is really understanding how you use informational tools for, in our case, you know, the survival of democracy and the victory of democracies over dictatorships. And we've stopped doing it. We did it in the Second World War. We did it in the Cold War, and then we stopped for many reasons. And the question is, will we be able to start again?
What do you think?
I think if we want to survive, we'll have to. I mean, we'll have to come up with our own version. We know how the other side work. They work through disinformation campaigns, conspiratorial TV channels, seeding doubt, cynicism. We have to embrace the modern technology and its possibilities, embrace the modern research and its possibilities in order to stand up for democracy. And, well, if we don't do it, we'll just lose.
So would it be right to suggest that those people who are ready and they're trying to defend democracy, but they're doing it the old way, in classic terms, let's say, are they not ready to embrace the role of a bad guy and in a type of way to not mirror the actions of the bad guys, of the actual bad guys, but to actually fight them to be effective? Maybe they're not ready for this role.
I think it's something we just forgot to do. I think we're kidding ourselves that we didn't do it. We did it in the Second World War. The British had something called the Political Warfare Executive, which fought Nazi propaganda. We did it in the Cold War. The Americans had something called the US Information Agency. And it's not about good or bad. I don't think good or bad is the right language for any of this. It's about, are we going to compete? You know? Are we going to compete in this space or not? And at the moment, we're just not. You know? It's not the job of journalism to do this. Journalism does something else, and it's having its own crisis, by the way. But it's not the job of journalism to do this. It's the job of what I think will have to be a new generation of information warriors who fight to support democracy. And it'll involve understanding audiences. It'll involve thinking about effects and impacts in really concrete ways, not in diffuse ways, not in like, we do good stuff, but like, what are we trying to achieve with which audiences and why? So it'll involve all those kind of thinkings, which we all have, but they're just never used to, you know, for geopolitical aims or for foreign policy aims. I mean, we use them all the time in elections. We use them all the time in campaigns. If you want a good example, the people who've been terrific at it has been the Green movement, you know, and Greenpeace, all these movements. They've been fantastic at understanding audiences, doing campaigns, pushing their agenda, politicizing it. They have done fantastic work. So this is not about good and bad. The cause is good or bad, but somebody has to invest in it and somebody has to do it. And so far it's unclear whose job it is. There's no department to do this. There's no institutions to do this. I think slowly we're getting there, but you know, we're way behind the dictators.
Do you see any parallels in modern day information warfare with World War II, something that you've been writing about in your new book that's coming?
Yeah, I mean, in a new book that's going to come out next year, I look at British attempts to undermine Nazi propaganda in Germany, so ways to reach German people. And it was a real mixed experience. There was obviously the BBC, and then there was something called, well, there was another side to British activity. It was called many different things. And that did much more playful and cunning things. Some which worked, some which didn't work. And I'm going to tell about that experience in an upcoming book. But we have experience from the Cold War as well, which is much more recent. But it does mean fighting. There's many different tricks you can use. There's many different methodologies you can use. There's many different ways you can engage audiences. But somebody has to do it, and someone has to compete.
And just one last question, really a pressing issue. It's not obvious at all in Ukraine, but worldwide, we touched upon it a little bit. Anti-Semitism. How do you feel it? How do you feel this trend is going? Is it too artificial to sustain by those who try to push it, or does it have chances to develop further into a global ideological thing?
Wow, I don't know. I haven't looked at it specifically. I think it's continued to be very prevalent in large bits of the world, so I don't think it ever went away. I think there was a taboo on it in Europe, but maybe that taboo is being lifted. I don't know. There was a taboo on it, after the Second World War. Maybe that's changing. I don't know. I'm not an expert on anti-Semitism as a sort of trend, but the amount of anti-Semitic hate crimes is rising. So there's data that would say that it's getting more of a problem.
I understand. What will be your message in these hard times to Ukrainian journalists? Just one.
It's very hard being a journalist during a war because it's your war too. And the classic aim of a journalist is to give your government hell. And that's the aim of a journalist. But then we're all fighting a war together. So it's really hard doing that balance. I get asked this a lot. The international experience is that being critical is actually, at the end of the day, better for national morale, because then there's trust. Then there's trust to the whole system. So famously, the BBC, which had huge restrictions during World War II, started talking about British military losses and was quite honest about what was going on the front. And that was a big deal, but it was a decision that was taken in order to make sure that there was trust, that audiences trusted it. And the BBC completely saw its role as supporting the morale of the nation, keeping up the morale of the nation, patriotism played a huge part. But they made this decision because losing trust would have been a bigger problem. So it's really hard. It's really hard. How do you get the balance right between maintaining cohesion, because we're all citizens, we all want to win together, and yet being the critical voice that also ensures that people trust the public discourse, or else they'll become cynical. So I don't know, it's really hard. It's really hard. I don't think it's an easy job.